I always say that some relationship stories long start like a calm road on a sunny afternoon, until you realize you've been driving with no brakes. In the beginning, I truly believed I'd found someone who finally got me. That kind of instant connection that makes you drop your guard faster than you should. And when you're starving for affection, even crumbs taste like a five-course meal. That's how I unknowingly stepped into one of those toxic relationship stories disguised as something harmless. Little by little, I started noticing tiny things that made my stomach twist, but I kept brushing them aside. I'd tell myself, he's just tired, or he's just intense, or he loves differently. It's wild how we can narrate over our own discomfort just to keep the illusion alive. Looking back, I can see how many times I silenced my instincts just to maintain a peace that never truly existed. And the funny part, my friends would ask if everything was okay, and I'd smile like I wasn't dissolving inside. Sometimes we become experts in pretending, especially when we don't want to accept what our heart already knows. But that quiet whisper inside me was getting louder, hinting that something was off. And that whisper would eventually lead me to the next realization, one that I wasn't ready for yet. It took me a while to notice the pattern, but that's the thing about toxic relationship stories. They don't explode, they leak. At first, his comments sounded like jokes, the kind you pretend to laugh at just to avoid tension. But over time, those jokes turned into little hooks that pulled at my self-worth. And before I knew it, I was editing myself in real time, trying not to trigger one of his mood swings. Looking back, it's wild how relationship stories long often hide the damage in the everyday moments. What really messed with my head were the micro twists of guilt. If I wanted space, I was cold. If I expressed a need, I was too much. If I brought up something that hurt me, suddenly I was the one hurting him. That kind of emotional gymnastics drains you more than running a marathon with a backpack full of bricks. I remember waking up tired, even on days when nothing had happened yet, as if my body already knew the emotional bill was coming. And here's the uncomfortable truth. When someone keeps you slightly off balance, they never need to push you hard. You start pushing yourself. It becomes this quiet survival game, one where you analyze every word before speaking. I once spent 20 minutes rewriting a simple text because I was afraid he'd misinterpret the tone. That's when I realized something was deeply wrong, even if I couldn't articulate it yet. And that sense of unease would only grow from there, leading me to an even harsher realization. There comes a point in some relationship stories where you catch yourself doing things you never thought you'd do, not because you want to, but because you're trying to avoid the storm. I remember noticing how I'd started speaking softer, walking lighter, thinking twice before having basic needs. It felt like I was folding myself into a smaller version just to fit inside a space that was never meant for me. And that's the scary part of toxic relationship stories. You don't break all at once, you chip away quietly. One day I looked in the mirror and didn't recognize the person staring back, not because of anything dramatic, but because my spark was dimmer. I had stopped giving opinions on things I used to be passionate about. I avoided sharing plans, dreams, even jokes, just to keep everything calm. And calm in that context wasn't peace, it was compliance. When you start shrinking to avoid conflict, you're not in a relationship, you're in an emotional cage with velvet walls. What opened my eyes was a simple moment. A friend laughed and said, "You don't sound like yourself lately." It hit me harder than any argument ever had. I realized I was living in constant self-editing mode, like my personality had to go through his approval filter before I could be me. And once that realization lands, even subtly, it plants a seed of awareness that begins to grow, pushing you to question what else you've been ignoring. The shift started quietly. After months inside one of those toxic relationship stories, my instincts finally pushed through the noise. I began noticing how every conversation left me tense, how his concern always carried judgment, it became obvious that I wasn't overreacting. I was responding to real patterns. And once you see the truth, even in relationship stories long, you can't unsee it. I caught myself replaying moments in my mind, and suddenly they made sense. The subtle guilt, the mood swings, the pressure to prove my loyalty, none of it was love. It was control. I realized I hadn't felt safe being myself in a long time. That clarity hit me fast, like someone turning on a light in a dark room. To stay grounded, I started writing down everything that happened. When you read your own life on paper, lies crumble quickly. I saw the imbalance, the manipulation, the erosion of who I was, and that realization created a quiet but firm certainty inside me. It was the beginning of the shift that would inevitably lead me towards the next step.
Once the truth was clear, rebuilding myself became a necessity, not a choice. I started by setting small boundaries, answering messages later, saying no without guilt, choosing silence instead of explaining myself endlessly. It felt strange at first, like learning to walk again, but even in relationship stories long, those tiny steps matter. They remind you that your life is yours. Breaking emotional habits was harder. I had trained myself to anticipate his reactions, so acting freely felt risky. But every time I chose my needs over his expectations, I felt a piece of myself returning. I remembered hobbies I had abandoned, opinions I had muted, dreams I had postponed. Slowly, I started choosing myself instead of performing for someone else. That shift rebuilt more than confidence. It rebuilt identity. I also added practical actions to make sure I stayed grounded. I read books like Women Who Run with the Wolves and Attached to understand my patterns. I took long walks without my phone, just to hear my own thoughts again. I reconnected with people who loved me without conditions. Each action pulled me further away from those toxic relationship stories and closer to who I actually was. And the stronger I became, the more obvious the next step became. When my identity started coming back, the decision to leave no longer felt impossible, it felt inevitable. I realized that staying meant shrinking again, and I couldn't return to that version of myself. In many relationship stories long, people wait for a dramatic moment to walk away, but mine was simple. I woke up one morning and knew I was done. No tears, no debate, just clarity. Leaving didn't give me the closure I once thought I needed. He didn't apologize, didn't understand, didn't suddenly become the person he pretended to be in the beginning. And that's when I understood the truth behind toxic relationship stories. The ending isn't about exposing the other person. It's about reclaiming the emotional freedom they took from you. The real victory was hearing my own voice again, steady, calm, and finally mine. I didn't need him to validate my experience. I didn't need a perfect goodbye. My closure came from choosing myself. And once that clicked, the path ahead became straightforward, pulling me toward the last part of this journey. Once I left, the silence felt strange, almost too big, but it was mine. For the first time in a long time, I wasn't managing someone else's moods or shrinking to avoid conflict. I could finally see how deeply those toxic relationship stories drain you long after they're over. Protecting myself became a daily decision, choosing peace over drama, clarity over confusion, and self-respect over the illusion of love. I rebuilt routines that made me feel alive again. I cooked meals I enjoyed, not the ones he preferred. I spent weekends with people who saw me, not versions they wanted me to be. I even got back into reading. Books like The Mountain Is You and Set Boundaries, Find Peace helped me stay centered. These small acts reminded me that healing isn't loud, it's consistent. And in many relationship stories long, consistency is what saves you. What surprised me most was how quickly my inner world stabilized once the chaos was gone. I started trusting my judgment again. I made decisions without second-guessing every consequence, and I realized something powerful. The person I almost lost wasn't him, it was me. Protecting myself became non-negotiable, and with that clarity, I finally stepped into a life that felt like my own. If any part of my story feels familiar, don't ignore that instinct. It's the same voice that eventually saved me. You don't have to wait for things to get worse to choose yourself. Start with one small step, even if it's just writing down how you feel today. Your clarity will come, and when it does, it will guide you out of places you were never meant to stay.